Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing some important international questions with a major US security analyst. Our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Richard Kramer, fellow in the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Election Focus. Skeptics allege that Washington, like Moscow, tampers with foreign elections and European politics. The veracity of such assertions can be examined by highlighting 6 stark contrasts between US and Russian policy. First, the US has provided assistance to democratize the political systems of countries emerging from communism. Democracies benefit America's security interests by strengthening regional stability and economic development. Moscow disrupts the development of democratic polities to disqualify states from qualifying for Western institutions or providing an attractive alternative to the Putinist system. Second, the US does not organize public protests as reforming countries develop their own indigenous pro-democracy movements, as was evident in Serbia, Ukraine, and Georgia, where citizens rebelled against official abuses of power. Russia funds and manipulates political groups to stage violent assaults against national institutions in targeted countries. The most flagrant example was the attempt to violently overthrow the Montenegrin government. Third, the US has openly engaged with the spectrum of political parties and encouraged transparency throughout the election process. Putin's Kremlin bribes vulnerable politicians in order to cultivate support for Moscow's foreign policies. Alternatively, it blackmails political leaders by using compromising material to either discredit or influence them. Fourth, the US offers support to an independent mass media to increase citizens' political participation. Moscow injects fraudulent stories into foreign media outlets and establishes anti-Western television networks. It also recruits journalists, lobbyists, and academics to participate in Moscow's anti-Western conspiracies. Fifth, the US encourages social media platforms to better inform citizens about democratic pluralism. Russia exploits the social media to spread disinformation and either boost or suppress voting in an effort to help specific candidates that favor Moscow. Sixth, US agencies do not hack the computers of politicians and parties to impact on election results. Russian intelligence operatives steal the communications of targeted politicians and release them through front networks such as WikiLeaks to influence public opinion. For Washington, democracy and security are viewed as 2 reinforcing pillars that strengthen the transatlantic alliance. The US does have autocratic allies in regions outside Europe if these contribute to regional security, but it has no democratic adversaries. It is in America's national interest to promote stable democracies inside secure alliances. Moscow's goal is to restore dominance over its European neighbors by undermining their security and weakening their sovereignty. In Kremlin calculations, stable democracies are inherently dangerous because they challenge the legitimacy of the autocratic Putinist system, while their aspirations for NATO membership to protect their achievements defies the Russian model of imposed security. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with my special guest, Richard Kramer, fellow in the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you, Richard, for joining me on today's show.
Excellent to be here, Janusz. Thank you for having me.
Let's begin, first of all, with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about its origins, its mission, activities, and your role, your precise role in the Institute?
Absolutely, I can give you a brief sketch. So the Foreign Policy Research Institute was established in the 1950s, and it was originally part of Penn University. It essentially was focused on national security issues.
That's Pennsylvania
University. Sorry, Pennsylvania
Yep.
University, yes. And it was part and parcel of that institution until sometime in the 1960s when it went independent, I believe in part to a disagreement over the containment policy. And there were those who supported it in academia and those at FPRI that felt they needed to have a stronger position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union at that period of time. As the organization progressed, it began to expand regionally and getting beyond, of course, just simply the relations between the United States and its Western allies and the Soviet Union. First and foremost, though, to this date, it prides itself in its bipartisan approach to analysis. And having been an associate there and then a fellow over the past few years, I can attest to that. It's been one of the more endearing, I think, important aspects of FPRI, which is consistently ranked as the #1 or #2 think tank on certain indices for under $5 million. The Eurasia program came out of the Project on Democratic Transitions, which was established by Ambassador Adrian Basora, a former ambassador to Czechoslovakia and then to Slovakia after the split. And that was largely focused on Central Europe at the time. And eventually, as interest began to expand, there was greater concerns about issues of security and military, about issues of energy, and it was within the last, I want to say it was about 18 months ago, 2 years ago at the most, that it became the Eurasia program, allowing for that broader range of considerations extending beyond simply Central and Eastern Europe, but to a certain degree into the Central Asian publics and the Caucasus as well.
So your role, you write, you lecture, you do reports, you have conferences and so forth. Is that
indeed pretty standard in respect to think tanks? One of the more important publications that we came out with back in 2014 was the Does Democracy Matter, which is a collection of essays focused on the importance of democracy assistance, and our overall argument with varying views and some comparatively dissenting, but generally in support of the idea of democracy remaining as a central pillar of U.S. foreign policy considerations going forward into the new millennium.
And you're based in Washington, even though
I'm based in Washington along with several other scholars. Again, it's the budget is under $5 million. There's a belief that we're able to punch above our weight, and that necessarily monetary resources shouldn't inhibit the human capacity that FPRI has at its disposal to analyze.
And I remember when I first came to the States many years ago, the publication Orbis. It's still published?
It is still published, indeed.
And that's a journal. It's a quarterly journal now, or is it?
It's a quarterly journal.
It's quarterly.
In addition to Orbis, which is one platform, there's the Geopoliticus blog on which I and others publish. We have also sort of occasional papers, if you will. Most recently, the Russian Foreign Policy Papers series, which I published in respect to Montenegro and also to Bosnia.
Okay, well, you've mentioned already 2 countries in the Balkans, so let's look at the Balkans' bigger picture. How do you view, almost 20 years since the end of the wars of the Yugoslav succession in the 1990s, and I suppose those wars finished in 99, plus the rebellion in Macedonia, you could say 2001, so 17, 18 years after the wars. How would you describe the security situation? Have we made progress to the extent that there won't be a reversion back to some new conflict, armed conflict, or do you see dangers of a regress now in the region?
Well, I certainly see dangers of regress, and I'm not entirely convinced they haven't gone away. They've always been there to a certain degree. I believe that they diminished significantly if we go back about 10 years, which coincides around the same time that the United States and the European Union slowly and gradually began to disengage. And I don't want to read too much into that term. It's not like suddenly they were abandoned, but between the problems within the EU, between the United States and its own response to the terror attacks of 9/11, well, Southeastern Europe became less of a priority. And I think certainly here in Washington, there's a sense like, well, the fighting seems to be over. This is a European affair, and we should let the European Union and related institutions help these countries continue forward in their democratic transitions and hopefully in their westward approaches. Since that time, of course, nature bores the vacuum, and power is no different. And as we slowly began to disengage, there were two phenomena that I believe began to come much more to the fore, and that, of course, was the unfortunately very easily played political card of ethno-nationalism and identity politics, which in the context of the Balkans is always a destabilizing factor, and one. And then two, of course, Russia, pursuing its own geopolitical interests in the region, sought to capitalize on those opportunities that were indigenous, first and foremost, but has been able to successfully exacerbate them to a point where, like, yes, indeed, we have seen the possibility of political violence increase significantly in recent years. And much of the report that I co-authored earlier this year in March, along with Emir Stojagic and Raif Bajrovic, focused on what was happening primarily at the time in Republika Srpska, RS, and what was
in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Thank you, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. What was a very clear effort to rearm RS security forces far beyond the policing needs that any entity or state would need in order to protect its citizens, coinciding at the same time with the formation and political and financial support for extreme ethno-nationalist paramilitaries that, young men with guns, they're kind of itching to use them by and large wherever you may be. These are just some of the changes that I've seen that has led to my personal and as well as professional alarm as to the direction that the Western Balkans in particular could go without increased U.S. and Western engagement.
I want to come back to the role of the EU, the role of outside powers, including the United States. Let's talk a little bit about what could be a potential success in the region, because we often talk about the instabilities, the failures, and we can come back to them, obviously. The Prespa agreement between Athens and Skopje, which came in a way out of the blue after so many years, over 20 years of let's say, roadblocks and log jams in the negotiation process over changing Macedonia's name. Suddenly there was this breakthrough. How would you assess now the chances for success now that we've had the referendum, we're in the process of constitutional changes in Skopje? How do you see this developing?
Well, taking a step back even in the run-up to the agreement, I think that many accolades should be given to Zoran Zaev. It seems, from what I see, it was largely his initiative, his decision to take the political will to resolve a festering issue that was preventing Macedonia from leaning in from becoming members of Western institutions like NATO and then possibly, hopefully, the EU. Right. So when you talk about successes, I believe what we've been seeing in Skopje is certainly indicative of that. And the fact that you have a country like Macedonia, whereby you have two predominantly ethnic groups that are living together in functioning harmony, that to me says a lot about what can be achieved with patience and with political will. We've seen that manifest. Now, some people will look at the referendum that was held with only 37% of a voter turnout as a question mark, as to, like, well, really, how committed are the people then beyond their governments? They still have elected representatives. There was a lot of emotion that was involved that I think the Macedonians themselves had to contend with in determining, like, well, here's the direction we'd like to see our country going, but this is my country and this is my language. How do we manage this? And yet it continues to go forward on both ends. Yeah. So, there's still a number of hurdles that need to be overcome. Obviously, the vote recently in the Sobranje was an important first step, but there will be two other votes, the most important likely to be within the next couple months, where there's still at least those in favor of going forward with the agreement with Greece and the constitutional amendments required of it are going to have to achieve another 2/3 majority. Right. That's a reasonable bar, but it's a high one.
What changed Greek minds? I mean, Greek parties, Greek leaders up till now have been adamantly opposed to making an agreement with Skopje which would legitimize the name Macedonia. In a way they have, they just qualified it. And the language remains Makedonski, the people, Makedonci. So what is it that made the Greeks compromise, the current government?
Not being a student of Greek politics, I'm hesitant to divine too much as to where what the bases were for the willingness to move forward on that. I would like to think that part of it is at least those in the ruling coalition and perhaps others, understanding that regional stability is going to be benefited to the extent that qualms such as these are resolved. And so doing within a time frame that works for the ruling Syriza party and for the Tsipras government in Athens, struck me as pragmatic, and understanding that we have a chance here, they're willing to do this, and frankly, despite the complicated relationship that Greece has with Russia, the fact that they were willing to go so far as to expel two diplomats suggests to me that they also get a sense that, look, this country is not going anywhere, and if we can get this resolved and if it's part of NATO, that's only going to bring greater stability, and with that, potential economic prosperity, which is usually what follows that kind of security achievement.
Right. And it's quite remarkable if you think when Tsipras came in as an ultra-leftist, and yet he could be the person presiding over, or let's say, signing off on Macedonia being the next country to join NATO, a NATO alliance, which the Greek left has always been, let's say, hesitant about.
Absolutely, but on the other hand, he's coming from a party that is pluralistic and inclusive in its outlook, like many other leftist parties, and isn't going to be faced with the same kind of potential internal fighting that would, say, appears to plague the ND party, the New Democracy, and others of those that have, well, frankly, a more nationalistic and more exclusive platform as a basis for trying to appeal to an electorate.
And we'll see what happens in the elections, because as you know, the Greek election season starts next spring, and due elections by the fall. So the clock is ticking on this agreement. There is limited time.
The clock is definitely ticking, and we're looking at Greek elections in October of 2019. The election season will start sooner. Basically, it's on the Sobranje now to really sit down and get this done, and hopefully approve the proposed constitutional amendments in the next couple of months, so that this can be resolved. It can be put to the Greek Parliament before we get into an electoral fight between ND and Syriza.
Right.
And and looking at the polls right now, Syriza could be in a better place, frankly. So yes, the clock is definitely ticking.
What impact will, assuming that it will be successful, what impact will this have on Kosovo in particular? And not, conversely, if it's not successful, what impact will it have on the region?
Well, we'll start with the negatives. I mean, conversely, if this doesn't go through, it's difficult to see when it's going to happen again. And I have some friends I've spoken with about this subject in Skopje who are... I don't believe that they're hyperbolic when they're speaking to a certain degree of like this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, certainly generational.
Right.
The impact on Kosovo, well, depending on Kosovo's status, and perhaps another subject that we'll discuss today, but the proposed idea of administrative border corrections.
We'll come to that.
We'll come to that, but that's clearly going to play in because a Macedonian state that doesn't see a future in NATO or either in the EU is going to have to look elsewhere in order to meet its economic and security concerns, to the extent that those are going to be acceptable or be perceived as acceptable. And it's for improving the situation of the Albanian minority in Macedonia is going to have an impact on, I believe, the region overall, but particularly Kosovo as well.
What is your view of, you mentioned the territorial exchanges, what is your view of this partition exchange question that came up quite hotly, I think, during the summer between Serbia and Kosovo, although it's been talked about further afield? What impact do you think? Is it, first of all, is it feasible that this could happen, given the positions of both governments?
That's a great question. I think if I can set feasibility aside for just a moment, I think that the act itself and the questions that it poses, particularly for the peoples of both Kosovo and Serbia, that generated such a response that the question needed to be put out there. We needed to get a sense like, is this something that people would even consider? Putting feasibility and the legality of it aside. What we've seen most recently, for example, with the Demostat poll that just came out in Belgrade, was that 76% of Serbs do not believe that Kosovar independence should be tied to EU membership. 61% of them are not in favor of the idea of, say, Prešovo Valley being exchanged as part of this. despite the fact that I guess like 4/5 of those that participated in the survey, they support the talks between Pristina and Belgrade, and I think that's excellent. We should be encouraged by that. That's on one end. And more recently, when we look at the parliament in Kosovo and their response to the floating of this idea and any traction to it, the virulent response of nay. This is not something that we support. I believe is reflective of a lot of people's sentiments about it. So, is it feasible? Wow. Well, in Kosovo, it's a parliamentary system. It's not a presidential system. So the executive has a somewhat limited scope in how much it's going to be able to promise in any kind of negotiations. Then, secondly, if you even get Parliament on board with it, my feeling about this subject is that it's of such dire consequence and has such effect on people is that it needs to be put to a popular referendum. And I think the same would be in Serbia as well. And we're just sort of looking at the numbers in that respect. I don't really see the feasibility on the radar screen. But.
Well, even before that step, I would say, is it likely that the government in Serbia would recognize Kosovo as an independent state? Because to have territorial exchange, which has happened in history, two countries do it, other than after a war, for example, when territory is taken from a country, two countries do it bilaterally. It's a bilateral agreement between two sovereign states, which would entail constitutional changes in Serbia to admit that Kosovo is an independent country.
Indeed. My read of the politics in Serbia at present is that trying to get that level of support, unless it was, well, arguably something that was effectively one-sided, like, okay, we're happy to extend, our borders into the northern part of Kosovo, but in exchange for what, and how much are they willing to give, and how's that going to be perceived by the public, and what's that going to do for you come the next elections? That's a pretty big gamble, and I'm not sure that it's one that Vučić would like to place his political futures on, quite frankly. But it does look good to the extent that he and Daci are actually talking about something, that they put something on the table to say, look, we're trying to find a way to get this forward. And despite my own inhibitions about the feasibility of such a project, that they're talking and that they're able to show that, at least to the rest of the world, to Europe and America and beyond, that they want to have some kind of resolution to this, I think deserves some consideration of merit and validity.
The longer the debate goes on and the questions continue about whether it is feasible, whether it will happen, how does it affect the wider region? Because as we know, there are many territories with compact minorities where certain political leaders do potentially have latent irredentist tendencies. Would, for example, Bosnia-Herzegovina, could this, even the talk of partition, even the talk of territorial exchange, does this impact on politics in other countries such as Bosnia?
I very much believe it does, and my understanding from my Bosnian friends and colleagues is that's precisely how they perceive it. And this is where I've gone on public record stating my opposition to the idea of any kind of land swap. Again, recognizing the, shall we say, the goodwill, behind the leaders of Kosovo and Serbia to try to move forward. I don't think that this is the proper way to do it, in large part because of the fact that we don't know what the ramifications would be, legal, political, and otherwise, when you have continually and stridently irredentist leadership in Banja Luka. You have a large portion of Bosnia's Croat minority that is looking for some other kind of arrangement within the federation, and one that could lead to possibly some kind of greater alliance with Croatia in the sense of its identity and its status. Not to mention what we see in Ukraine and Georgia and elsewhere. When I look back at the 20th century, and indeed you're correct that there have been these kind of agreements in the past. We've seen them. We've seen them between the Chinese and India, for example. They've been able to achieve some kind of modicum of understanding, and they move forward, and relations improve, and that's great. But I think so much of this is it's about feasibility, it's about timing, and in a region where these irredentist claims persist to the extent that they do, talking about this at this juncture right now, especially when I don't believe that it's especially feasible for the reasons I just explained. Why do we want to open the Pandora's box on this? For what? When there could be other ways to resolve the undefined status of Kosovo in Belgrade. And returning to Macedonia briefly, look, it took a long time, but there was enough political will, people's ducks were in a row, the time was right, and they were able to move forward on it. And I know that's a hard pill to swallow if you're sitting in Pristina, if you're sitting in Belgrade, that you're to a certain degree, the actions that you wish to pursue for the benefit of your peoples, then your estimate may be stymied because of the consequences they have in the region. But you're a part of that region, it's not going away. Why you would want to pursue something that has very likely unintended and negative consequences that in the end could have blowback and the very negative impact on your own peoples, is this the way to go? So,
what do you think is behind this? I mean, how was this question raised? We know there have been some, let's say, behind-the-scenes talk of territorial exchange, or let's say some adjustments between Albania and Serbia, sometimes over the heads of Kosovo. How do you think this new debate over the summer began with Taci and Vučić? What lies behind it?
I can't say precisely for sure what lies behind it. I know that there are Serbian thinkers and elites and activists that have been for a long time looking for a way to get through the impasse, so that Belgrade can hopefully continue on in a direction towards at least EU membership. You know, NATO membership is a different matter, but recognizing that this need be resolved. Right now you have someone in power in Belgrade. You have Aleksandar Vučić, who, it's interesting to me the extent to which there are a lot of, the debate as to like, what is this man really thinking? Is he a pan-Serbian ethno-nationalist in sheep's clothing, or is he really a technocrat that's trying to balance a lot of competing interests in a very difficult neighborhood, not to mention his backyard? Right now could be a window for that. We don't know where we're going to be 5 years from now. The trends in the region right now, particularly in respect to blood and soil narratives and ethnic identity politics, are worrying. And it could very well be that there's a fear that if this issue isn't resolved now, it's hard to see how the situation is going to get better before it gets worse.
Looking at Bosnia, we've already touched upon Republika Srpska, the separatist tendencies amongst some of the politicians in that entity. Regardless of the Kosovo-Serbia relationship, there has been certain moves towards, let's say, increasing the autonomy of Republika Srpska, potentially threatening with separation. These elections that took place not so long ago, what impact is this going to have on Bosnia's internal makeup?
I think in the short term, and it's very difficult to say because so much is in play right now, but I feel that in the short term, I'd be more willing to put money on that this is going to be a bit of the status quo going forward, rather than, say, the possible dissolution of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It complicates things on a number of levels. I mean, I think first turning to the elections in RS, Dodik did well. The SNSD did quite well, actually. And SDS right now, the primary opposition party is
Serbian Democratic Party.
Serbian Democratic Party, thank you. They are they're having their own internal struggles, and they look poised to be having internal elections soon, in part to determine whether or not they want to go into the alliance with Dodik, with SNSD, or otherwise. That ought to tell you something about the extent to which he's been able to continue to consolidate power. And recent moves, we're less than a month outside of the election, recent moves in terms of those who have been appointed and those who haven't, definitely suggests that he feels that he very much has the upper hand. That doesn't make things especially easy for anyone who wants to see a more centralized and a more united Bosnia. And so that's worrisome. Now, the good side, the upside of the recent elections in Bosnia is that Komšić is the Croat president in the tripartite presidency. And
Komšić is the moderate
yes,
Croatian politician.
Thank you, from Democratic Front. And Željko Komšić is someone, he's been in power before. He's shown himself as being inclusive. He's shown himself as recognizing he himself as first and foremost a citizen of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He fought bravely in the war, not as a Croat, not as a Bosniak, not as a Serb, but he fought as a member of a citizen of Bosnia.
Right.
And I think that's highly commendable. And it certainly gives me a lot of confidence about where a lot of Bosnians, at least in the Federation obviously, would like to see the direction that their country takes. To the extent that that is going to be the outcome, given the rather vile response that I believe has been coming out of HDZ BIH, the ethnic Croat party that is led by Dragan Čović, that is very worrisome. But it's whether or not he has sufficient political will, despite all the efforts that are made thus far legally and also geopolitically, and working with Zagreb and making appeals to the European Union Parliament and what have you, about in his estimate and his supporters' estimates, the lack of legitimacy of the elections, that's certainly troublesome. What it spells for me is not that Irredenta's claims are going to be readily realized in Bosnia anytime soon, but the progress that the country stands to make towards being more unified and more centralized, it's going to be a tough slog, I believe, over the next year or so.
Well, as we know, status quo only lasts for so long. Some things inevitably almost, let's say, tips the balance in the favor of one or other party, or some party is provoked into some action, or tries to use certain opportunities to gain a little bit more. Do you think, I mean, looking at it from outside, have the elections contributed to the dangers of separation in Bosnia, or have they sort of put the lid on that for the time being?
These particular elections?
These particular elections, yeah.
I feel that they put more so put the lid on it for the time being. But as indicated, it's tough. On one hand, you have one political leader who is most vociferous in his desire for his entity's independence, consolidating power in Banja Luka. And on the other hand, you have the will of the people in the Federation saying that they want otherwise. That people that were, I was there in Bosnia on the ground in the run-up to the elections. I wasn't there actually for it, but my sense in talking to people there and in the aftermath is that, look, we have these many people that came out. Okay, let's say that there were a number of Bosniaks that went out and voted for Komšić. Okay. There might very well have been some Serbs that went out and they voted for Čović. Okay. That's how it's supposed to work. When we talk about, if I may, there's so many of these arguments about equality and equal representation and what have you.
Yeah.
And what was intended as part of the Dayton Peace Accords. Look, equality for me is not separation but equal. Equality for me is when all citizens under the law receive equal treatment before the law. And that's when someone goes to the ballot box, regardless of their ethnicity, that means they get to vote for who they want. You don't get to vote for someone, you only get to only vote for those in your ethnic group.
Right, but the way Dayton was designed and the way a lot of people think, and I've been in a region for 25, almost 30 years, it's not so much equality of individuals, it's equality of the three major ethnic groups as collectivities. Okay. That's the way a lot of people perceive it.
That's the way a lot of people perceive it. I mean, a couple points on that, if I may. One, discussions I've had with lawyers that were at Dayton when the Accords were being put together. If you look at the Accords and you look at the focus on security, it's clear that the aim was, look, we have to get everyone to stop fighting. Yep. All right, so that's how this is going to happen. And in the words of one lawyer who was there, he said, look, when it came to the other parts, we sort of cut and pasted from older documents, older constitutions within Yugoslavia. We sort of put them in there with the sense that, all right, like this is here, not quite placeholder, but and eventually we're going to start to move on. I mean, no one at Dayton who could look at a country like Lebanon would say, well, what we really need to ensure that there's going to be ethnic quotas as a way to get this country moving forward and be part of the European community. That's one. Two, looking at, for example, at the European Court of Human Rights on this issue, if you look at the Sinjic-Finci case in 2009, I think that made it pretty clear that...
This is the Jew and the Roma who, let's say, went to the court because they didn't belong to the three ethnic groups and could gain office.
Precisely. The spirit of that ruling, to me, encapsulates that idea that citizens are equal before the law. And no one, those who were at Dayton that wanted to see the war end and see Bosnia become a functioning democracy did not first and foremost think the best way that we're going to be able to do this is by ensuring ethnic quotas in a variety of offices throughout the country. No. The idea was that we'll move past this, people will be able to, as is their right, to be able to determine what they want to say, for whom they want to vote, and that should not be restricted on whatever your last name may be, whatever your faith may be, whatever your ethnicity may be. That anyone would argue that the folks at Dayton wanted something like that to be arranged in perpetuity, I find that very hard to stomach.
Looking over the borders from Bosnia, whatever Dodik and separatist tendencies in Republika Srpska, wherever they are, wherever they stand, what is the view of Belgrade, do you think? It doesn't necessarily help Belgrade to have a separatist unit in Bosnia wanting to join Serbia. Puts a lot of pressure, potential pressure on Belgrade. It certainly won't qualify for the EU if it has any aspirations to a half of Bosnian territory. So what is that relationship? How do you see it between Banja Luka and Belgrade?
Well, I mean, I think the Milorad Dodik has made his intentions pretty clear and his desires. So we'll put those aside for a second, because it's really more a matter of what the leadership in Belgrade wants, which is obviously by no means a monolith. So, so for the sake of this conversation, I'm just going to focus on Aleksandar Vučić. Goodness gracious, I don't envy the man. I don't envy his job. And whatever may happen in respect to Kosovo's status and how it's recognized or not in Belgrade, the impact that very well may have on, say, Vojvodina, which, curious to me, no one really seems to be talking about the implications of what kind of, the bases for some kind of land swap based on ethnic majorities and what that means for the parts of northern Serbia.
But also Sanjak, which is heavily
also
Bosnian.
Sanjak, thank you, precisely. So you have that. You have your own issues of just between trying to keep a coalition together, stay in power, get your economy to function, which could be obviously a lot stronger in Serbia given the human capital that the country has. You want to put on top of that absorbing something like RS or having some kind of relationship with a country that is, at least in the majority of European capitals right now, sorry, an entity right now, which in the majority of European capitals is considered just that and has very little support for the prospect of independence. I don't see how it's in his political agenda and his political longevity in office to be getting in bed on this. I don't see how where the calculus rests that it's going to give him what he wants in order to have the support and the confidence of the people that voted him into office.
And Croatia? What would be the reaction in Croatia if there was a split in Bosnia? Or if, let's say, certain, like you mentioned, the HDZ in the federation push for a third entity?
Well, it seems right now that there's a bit of hand in glove, isn't it, coming out of Zagreb? I mean, with Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovica, her government, and then looking at Andrej Plenković and the way that he has he's sort of become the surrogate advocate for the concerns of HDZ, BIH in Zagreb and beyond in Brussels. For them, let's play this out. Very difficult being an EU member state, being a member of NATO. There would probably be a lot of reluctance, I think, certainly from Germany, at least, to the extent that Angela Merkel is still in power. She's made her opinions pretty clear on the idea of land swaps and seems to be against them. And the redefining of these borders. they might think that that's going to be in their longer term interests. Personally, I don't see that. If you have, what would then, let's play out a worst case scenario. And it's just simply that, it's a scenario. But let's say an isolated rump state of many unemployed young men and women, some who will leave, those that won't will become despondent, they'll become disillusioned, and I certainly don't think a large number, but a small number of them could very well be persuaded by the toxic and poisonous ideologies purveyed by those that have those who think that jihad amounts to political violence for any means necessary. I mean, look at Croatia. Look at how much of Croatia's economy depends on tourism, all right? You want to have a neighboring state where a few radicalized and misled young men can, God forbid, pull something like what we saw in Tunisia, go to a beach with an automatic weapon, or just set off a couple bombs here and there.
Like Egypt.
Like Egypt. What would that do to Croatia's bid to be like the second Italy on in the Adriatic coast, if you will? That would tank it overnight. So, if I'm sitting in Zagreb and I'm trying to think about my country's economic situation, where I want to be in the long term, for the sake of a dwindling minority next door, that I do have some heartfelt concerns. I don't think that their concerns should be disregarded, but is it in my interest to sacrifice those so that we can incorporate a bit of extra land that is only going to bring so much value to my economy, to my country's security, with that kind of scenario possibly in the offing? From a rational perspective, that wouldn't make sense to me if I was a decision maker sitting in Zagreb.
Yeah, very good points. Let me ask you, because our time is beginning to tick as well, let me introduce another factor of instability in the region, throughout the region, which is Russian state subversion. We've touched upon it a little bit, but I think it'd be useful to get your views. Specifically, what do you think will be Moscow's reaction to the approval of the Prespa Accords? NATO's already started the process for for entry for Macedonia. Can we expect some new Russian provocation? Remember the coup attempt after the Montenegrin elections in October 2016? Can you envisage some new Russian provocations, some new Russian reaction to such moves?
Well, I certainly don't think the Russians they haven't taken this, nor will they believe they continue to take it lying down. I think we need to looking at Montenegro. I think it's important that we recognize the significance of what happened there. That was a Russian-backed coup d'etat of like-minded political pan-Serbian ethno-nationalists that had a vision for a country that Russia supported, and it was one whereby Montenegro would not be part of NATO. To such extent, as we state in our report from the FPRI published this summer, that the Russians had sent 50 GRU troops through Zlatibor into Montenegro the night of the coup attempt. This, to our knowledge, is the first time that Russia has deployed hard power assets outside of the former Soviet Union in an effort to further a political goal, a coup d'etat. Like, if that isn't alarming, I don't know what is. Now, having said all of that, so we're on watch. The coup attempt failed. In the end, it seems like it was reasonably mediocre as an overall project. And I think the aftermath and the egg on the face that the Kremlin got as a consequence of that probably will shy them away from the idea of
Stalin would roll in his grave, presumably. At the
presumably,
attempt.
and so, something to that effect, being repeated in Macedonia. No, I don't think that we're looking at that at this point. But there are plenty of other means, and the Russians have done. However you may or may not feel about the Kremlin under Vladimir Putin, have done an amazing job of being able to exercise a range of resources in the most cost-effective manner. So, yes, do I think there will be an effort of, shall we say, an exercise of political violence in order to achieve a certain outcome before Parliament sits again to discuss the name change? Mm-hmm. No. Do I think there will be, for example, continued and proactive online campaigns via bots and other means? Mm-hmm. Do I think that there will be efforts to continue to try to sway members of VMRO to vote against this? Mm-hmm. You know, this in combination with efforts the Russian embassy has taken, there's been roughly, according to the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, 30 organizations, mm-hmm. you know, with sort of pan-Slavic, ultra-nationalist ideas that have been created and supported by the Russian embassy in Skopje. Mm-hmm. They report on inroads that have been made into Macedonia's military and trying to cultivate relationships there. Mm-hmm. I mean, so something as egregious as an attempted coup d'etat? No. Do I believe that there are going to be other efforts to try to derail this process, both there and possibly continuing in Greece as well? Absolutely. Having said all of that, I'm always at pains to remind people regarding Montenegro, and I think it should be kept in mind with Macedonia as well, that once you're in NATO, it doesn't mean that you're in NATO for perpetuity. Mm-hmm. And you yourself recall that France had a somewhat distant relationship with Brussels command there for a while.
It doesn't mean you can't be destabilized either.
Doesn't mean you can't be destabilized either. Mm-hmm. So I raise that in an effort for those that care about the democratic future and the hopefully westward integration mm-hmm. that we'd all like to see in Southeast Europe, and particularly in the Balkans, that this demands consistent engagement and cultivation. Mm-hmm. So.
How would you, I mean, looking at, let's say, the arms of Russian subversion in the Balkans, disinformation, corruption, promoting armed conflicts, ethnic tensions and so forth, how can we better immunize ourselves or help the region immunize itself from these factors?
Well, to the extent that rule of law becomes a reality, mm-hmm. like a genuinely respected and legitimized institution as part of a functioning democracy, along mm-hmm. with checks and balances and right to free and fair representation in elections. That I think is the biggest issue. I mean, essentially, to the extent to which governments and economies are corrupted in the region, there's going to be that many more opportunities for subversive and malign Russian influence to be mm-hmm. able to take advantage of what's going to be a disillusioned population that sees their leaders as self-interested crooks. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that on one level, from political engagement from Brussels, Washington, and London, with the leaders in those countries and trying to get them to uphold to their commitments, whatever it may be, whether it's part of a MAP process or whether it's the reform agenda for Bosnia, mm-hmm. that needs to occur. But then also at a grassroots level, there needs to be not just more money for civil society and in support for those that share our democratic values in trying to get their countries on the right track. But I would argue that we need to have more of a discussion like, we've done all of this so far. Ethno-nationalism is still a real problem in the region. Nationalist narratives, whether it's in an EU NATO member state like mm-hmm. Croatia, which are still very strong, as well as into ethnically Serb populations and arguably into some Albanian populations. Mm-hmm. To the extent to which these persist, we need to think differently about the conversation that democratic civil society and those in the West that support them are having with their constituencies, with their peoples, about the benefits of having not just the economic prosperity that comes with EU membership, but its direct link to having a democratic government that's going to be able to effectively govern and represent interests, and an effective rule of law, so that economic prosperity can be realized.
Well, one of the, I suppose, reasons that the US has, if not withdrawn, but as you mentioned earlier, stepped back, is that the EU is seen as a source of attraction, as a magnet. The prospect of entry. Do you think the EU has done enough in recent years to draw the remaining West Balkan countries into the fold in terms of their commitments, their willingness to be open to further enlargement?
I'd say on the whole, no. And I think returning to Macedonia and the referendum there, which to me, Janusz, was very telling. It's very interesting. I mean, for so long, I think there's been this sense among sort of the more rationally minded in the EU, that like, well, you know, the carrot of economic prosperity is sort of the salve, it's the cure-all, and is, you know, as long as we have that, the possibility of ascension is out there, and chapters are open, then, you know, the people will follow. But what Macedonians told us was that, yes, but. And I think that to me was a resounding message that there needs to be an understanding that it's not just about a paycheck. You know, it's not just about a standard of living. That there are some ideas. There's a part of a people's mythos that is valid. It's important, and if you don't address it and you don't take it into considerations into whom you're trying to partner with, even if they're not always the simplest partners, they might be rather prickly. Say, for example, some of the churches in the region. You got to figure out a way to talk to them and work with them, because so could the EU do more? Yes, but it's not just a matter of numbers. It's comprehensive. It's a matter of an outreach.
Is it also the question of, let's say, losing faith in EU promises, that the EU has promised so much but doesn't seem to be moving? In other words, people are becoming disillusioned that it can happen. So, you know, the old phrase, why would I want to be a member of a club that doesn't want me to be a member?
You know, I could certainly see, if I was a citizen in, say, a given Western Balkan nation, why I would have that kind of sentiment. You know, on the other hand, if you look at polls, you know, whether it was IRI's last poll in Macedonia and recent the Demostat poll that I mentioned recently in Serbia, my own sense of things in Bosnia. You know, these are, you still see the numbers largely in favor of being a part of the EU. And, you know, frankly, at this juncture, what alternative do you have? I mean, are you going to just have the Chinese come and sort of like build a bunch of infrastructure projects that don't employ your people and that put you into some kind of debt that's going to make you beholden to them and whoever they determine to be there? In perpetuity. Yeah, in perpetuity. Like, you know, and you know, give people some credit. They kind of see what's going on. So where are you going to go? You know, in the end, you know, especially given young people's attractions and the visions that many of them seem to have, based on polling and based on my own conversations about where they want to see their countries go. You know, it's not towards Beijing. And the only way that you can solidify and consolidate that is by achieving that membership, even if it's an imperfect union. And you know what? We knew it was always going to be an imperfect union.
It's not towards Beijing or Moscow or Istanbul either, but that's two other questions. Very last question, Richard. What's your verdict on US policy under this administration in the region? Some would say we've withdrawn too much, we've given too much over, we've neglected the region, we've given too much over to the EU. Others would say, well, we've tried to resolve some of the outstanding questions. Look at what we discussed, the Macedonian-Greek dispute, Serbia-Kosovo. We've tried to get them back to the table to look at the serious questions, normalization of relations, bilateral relations. How do you see it?
So far, I think the administration is doing well. It could do a lot more. Okay, but let's be fair. There's a lot that's been going on, frankly. But when you look at, for example, the extent to which both this administration and Congress was vociferously in support of Montenegro becoming a part of NATO. Look at Secretary Mattis, you know, visiting Skopje as he did, followed by Assistant Secretary Wes Mitchell's letter, which I thought was the absolute right thing to do. And
the letter to Wim wrote.
The letter to Wim wrote in support. Thank you. You know, the current ambassador in Sarajevo, who has issued, you know, uncommon statements about, look, America is not here to interfere. We're not here to pick sides. We're here because we want to see a democratic and unified Bosnia. I mean, like strongly worded statements. These are all, to me, very encouraging. And I think when we look at the people at the NSC and when we look at some of the people at State, and I mentioned Secretary Mattis, you know, there seems to be some consensus on that the Western Balkans are important, and that for the sake of European security, we can't just sort of leave it to the Europeans to determine how this is going to work out. Which is great, because in the end, there's a transatlantic alliance. It's been shaken, and we'll see where it's going to go. But with its perseverance, I believe that continued engagement in Southeastern Europe is going to bring the kind of security benefits and eventual economic prosperity that makes everyone a winner, save, for example, Moscow and Beijing.
On that note, on that optimistic note, thank you very much,
Thank
Richard.
you very much, Janusz.
A real pleasure, and we'll have you back at some point in the future when there's never a dull moment in the Balkans.
Absolutely.
I'm sure we're going to be coming back to this. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues here at RTK and VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.